Imagine working for months on the most important presentation of your college career, only to have your own teammate delete every single slide 5 minutes before you're supposed to present. We were supposed to be a team. We stayed up for nights building the perfect pitch. Then, right before we walked into the conference room, he looked me in the eyes and said, "I got an offer from the company you're presenting to. They only want one intern. It's me." This is the complete story of the ultimate backstab, the devastating fallout, and how I turned betrayal into my greatest comeback. If you've ever had a teammate or friend sabotage you, this story will hit hard. Stay until the end, the revenge is worth it. My name is Nora Bellamy. I was a senior at Kessler Business School, majoring in marketing and digital strategy. For as long as I could remember, I had one dream: landing a prestigious internship at Meridian Digital, one of the hottest tech marketing firms on the East Coast. Their internship program was legendary. It almost always led to a full-time offer after graduation, with a starting salary most people in my program only dreamed about at 2 a.m. over cold coffee and spreadsheets. People whispered about it in the hallways like it was some kind of golden ticket. Get into Meridian and your whole life changes. That was the rumor, anyway, and I believed it completely, because I needed it to be true. I grew up in a small apartment above my parents' pharmacy in a suburb nobody had heard of unless they'd broken a bone nearby. My mother filled prescriptions behind the counter 6 days a week. My father managed the books late into the night, muttering about margins and insurance reimbursements. They never once told me I had to be successful. They didn't need to. I watched them work themselves down to the bone for a business that barely kept the lights on, and I made myself a promise in 8th grade that I would build something bigger, something that didn't depend on the mercy of insurance companies and slow-paying customers. Business school felt like the first real step toward that promise. Meridian felt like the second. I thought I had found the perfect partner for the final group presentation that would decide everything. His name was Caleb Whitmore. Caleb and I had been paired together since sophomore year, first in an introductory marketing seminar, then in a strategy elective, then again in our junior year capstone project on brand repositioning. It felt less like coincidence and more like the universe kept nudging us into the same lane. He was charming in that effortless way some people are born with, the kind of charm that made professors laugh at his jokes even when the jokes weren't that funny, the kind that made people forgive him for being 15 minutes late because he'd walk in already apologizing with a grin that disarmed you before he finished the sentence. He came from money. Not obscene money, but comfortable, connected money, the kind where his father golfed with people who mattered and made a phone call instead of filling out an application. At first, I saw his connections as an advantage rather than a threat. We balanced each other well, or so I thought. I was the strategic planner, the one who could build a 40-slide deck at 3 a.m. and still catch the typo nobody else would notice. I obsessed over data, over structure, over making sure every claim we made in a pitch could be backed up by a footnote. Caleb handled the client-facing charm, the research calls, the icebreakers that made stiff executives loosen their ties and laugh. Where I was precise, he was magnetic. It felt, for 2 years, like a genuinely good partnership. We won 3 case competitions together. The first one, sophomore year, was a regional student challenge sponsored by a local beverage startup, and we won mostly because I stayed up until 4 a.m. building a distribution model while Caleb charmed the judges during Q&A with an ease I couldn't have replicated if I'd tried for a decade. The second, junior year, was a statewide competition against 6 other schools, and we placed first out of 31 teams. I still remember the feeling of standing on that small stage in a rented hotel ballroom, holding a cheap plaque that felt like the heaviest, most important object I'd ever touched. Caleb hugged me afterward and said, this is just the start for us. And I remember believing him completely, the way you believe things when you're 20 and the future still feels like something you get to choose. Our capstone project, the brand repositioning deck for a struggling local outdoor retailer, got mentioned by name in the department newsletter, a rare honor reserved for maybe 2 or 3 projects a year out of an entire graduating class. Professor Hellaway, who ran our senior seminar and had a reputation across the department for being nearly impossible to impress, once told the class flatly that our deck was the kind of work I'd expect from a junior associate at a real agency, not from seniors still worrying about finals. I remember Caleb turning to me in the hallway afterward, eyes bright with something that looked, at the time, like genuine shared pride. "We're actually good at this," he said. "Like, genuinely good. We should keep doing this after graduation, start something together, maybe, once we've both got a few years of experience somewhere." I believed him. I let myself imagine a future built partly around his ambition and mine intertwined, which in hindsight feels almost embarrassing to admit. Outside of coursework, we spent enough time together that our friend groups started to overlap. We grabbed coffee between classes at least twice a week. He met my roommate. I met a rotating cast of his fraternity brothers, most of whose names I never bothered to learn because they came and went with the semesters. He once drove 2 hours to help me move out of a summer sublet when my actual ride fell through, and I remember thinking, watching him load boxes into his car without complaint, that he was a genuinely decent person underneath the polish. I considered him a friend, not just a classmate I tolerated for the sake of a grade, but someone I trusted with the thing I cared about most, my future, and by extension, the fragile, hard-won stability of my entire family. Looking back now, I think that trust was the whole problem. I built my entire strategy for the biggest opportunity of my life around a person I never once seriously questioned, because questioning him would have meant questioning 2 years of shared history that I badly wanted to believe was solid ground rather than something that could give way beneath me without warning. For the Meridian presentation, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The company was visiting campus as part of their annual university partnership tour, and this year, Kessler Business School had been selected as one of only 4 schools nationwide to host a live pitch round. Meridian was there to select just 2 interns from a pool of over 200 applicants across the senior class. The final round was a 20-minute team presentation pitching a complete digital marketing campaign for Meridian's newest product line, an AI-assisted content platform they were preparing to launch to small businesses. Whichever team impressed the executives the most would walk away with internships that, historically, converted into full-time offers with 6-figure starting packages by the following spring. Everyone in our cohort wanted it. Study groups quietly turned into rival camps. People who used to share notes started guarding their research like state secrets, suddenly cagey about which industry reports they'd found or which alumni they'd managed to reach for informational interviews. Group chats that used to be full of memes and complaints about professors went quiet, replaced by clipped, strategic messages between people who no longer fully trusted each other. It was, without exaggeration, the most competitive 6 weeks of my entire academic life, and somewhere underneath the polite smiles in the hallway, everyone knew exactly how much was riding on those 20 minutes in front of Meridian's executives. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me. I spent 3 separate weekends cold emailing small business owners in the surrounding towns, offering to buy them coffee in exchange for 20 minutes of their time talking about how they handled their own marketing. 40 of them eventually agreed. I drove to diners and hardware stores and a family-owned bakery that smelled so good I nearly abandoned the whole project to just eat pastries for an hour, taking notes by hand because I didn't want to seem like I was rushing them through a survey. Those conversations became the backbone of the customer journey map that would later carry almost the entire presentation on its own, once I had nothing else left to lean on. Caleb, for his part, seemed just as committed during those 6 weeks, at least outwardly. He ran the numbers on customer acquisition costs. He reached out to 2 Meridian alumni from our school for informal calls, coming back with insights about what the executives tended to respond well to in these live pitch sessions. Apparently they hated overly rehearsed jokes and loved specific, sourced data. He sat beside me in the library some nights until close, trading edits back and forth on slide language, and there were moments during those 6 weeks when I genuinely thought we might be building something that would outlast the internship itself, some kind of partnership that could carry into whatever came next. I designed 41 slides, data visualizations, competitive landscape breakdowns, a full customer journey map I built from scratch using survey data I'd collected myself from 40 small business owners in town. Caleb and I had worked on this for 6 weeks straight, and I do mean straight. There were nights I didn't sleep more than 4 hours because I was refining slide transitions or rewriting a value proposition for the 3rd time. Caleb was supposed to handle the financial projections and the closing argument, the part where we'd ask for the internship directly and make our case for why it should be us. We rehearsed the full pitch more times than I could count, timing ourselves down to the second, running through Q&A scenarios late into the night in empty classrooms because the library closed too early for how much we needed to practice. The morning of the presentation, we met in the small conference room on the 3rd floor of the business building, an hour early, to do one final run-through before the Meridian team arrived. I remember exactly how the room looked, the long oval table, the projector humming faintly as it warmed up, the smell of the industrial coffee machine down the hall. I remember feeling, for just a moment, completely at peace. Like all the sacrifice had led to this single morning and everything was finally about to pay off. We ran through the opening 3 times that morning, then the closing twice more, adjusting the pacing so it landed right at 19 minutes, leaving a comfortable buffer before the 20-minute cutoff. Caleb cracked a joke about Professor Holloway's tie collection that made me laugh harder than it deserved, probably just from nerves finally finding somewhere to go. I remember checking my reflection in the dark window of the conference room, smoothing down a blazer I'd bought secondhand and altered myself because I couldn't justify the cost of a new one, and thinking that I looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like someone who belonged in a room like this. Everything felt perfect. Until 5 minutes before the Meridian executives walked in. Caleb was standing by my laptop when I came back from the bathroom, where I'd splashed cold water on my face and practiced my opening line one more time in the mirror. He was typing something, his face angled down toward the screen, and for a second I thought he was just double-checking the slide order like he sometimes did out of nervous habit. "Ready to crush this?" I asked, forcing a grin, adrenaline already buzzing under my skin. He turned around slowly. His usual easy grin, the one that had disarmed professors and clients and me for 2 straight years, was gone. In its place was something colder, something I didn't recognize on his face because I had genuinely never seen it there before. "Nora, I need to tell you something." Before I could respond, before I could even process the tone of his voice, he clicked several times on the trackpad, fast and deliberate, like he'd rehearsed the motion. Then he closed the laptop. "What did you just do?" My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees. "I deleted the slides, Nora. All of them. The backup drive too." The room seemed to tilt. I lunged past him and reopened the laptop with hands that were already shaking. The project folder was empty, not moved, not renamed, just gone, the little folder icon sitting there hollow and gray like a wound. The shared cloud backup he'd had access to since week 1, the one I'd trusted him to help maintain, had been wiped as well. 41 slides. 6 weeks. Gone in under a minute. Caleb, what the hell? We go on in 5 minutes. He looked at me without a trace of guilt, and that absence of guilt frightened me more than the deletion itself. I got an offer from Meridian yesterday. A verbal one, but it's basically locked in. They only want one intern out of this presentation, not two like they told everyone. It's going to be me. My dad made some calls to someone on their board last week. They like my profile better. I'm sorry, but this is just business. I stared at him, speechless, the words not fully landing yet, my brain still trying to reconcile the version of him I'd known for 2 years with the person standing in front of me. Some small, stubborn part of me kept waiting for him to laugh, to say it was some kind of terrible joke, to reach back into the laptop and undo whatever he'd just done. That part of me kept waiting even as the seconds ticked past and his expression never once wavered. You're lying, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. You're lying, right? Tell me you didn't actually. I'm not lying. He said it almost gently, which somehow made it worse. I wouldn't do this if I had another option, Nora. But this is the only shot I've got at something this good, and my dad made it clear this doesn't happen twice. He continued, his voice flat, almost bored, like he was explaining a scheduling conflict rather than detonating my entire future. You're good, Nora. Genuinely good, probably better than me on the actual work. Everyone knows that, honestly, I think even the professors know that. But they want someone with connections. Someone who fits a certain image for the board deck they show investors. Just take the loss gracefully. You'll land something else eventually. You always do. That last line, you always do, was somehow the part that stuck with me longest, because it meant he'd thought about this. He hadn't panicked into a bad decision 5 minutes before the pitch. He'd planned it, weighed it, decided I was resilient enough to absorb the damage, and moved forward anyway. Before I could even form a response, the door opened. The Meridian team walked in, 3 executives in sharp, tailored suits, trailing behind Professor Holloway, who looked delighted, completely unaware that the presentation he was about to introduce no longer existed in any file on this earth. Ready? The lead executive asked, a woman with silver-streaked hair and an expression that suggested she'd sat through dozens of these pitches and rarely found them memorable. Caleb turned on the charm instantly, like flipping a switch. Absolutely. We're excited to show you what we've prepared. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. My entire future, 6 weeks of sleepless nights, my parents' sacrifices, every ounce of ambition I'd poured into this one 20-minute window, had just been deleted by the person I trusted more than almost anyone outside my own family. I had no slides. No notes on paper. No printed handouts, because Caleb had insisted weeks earlier that printed materials looked old-fashioned and that we should keep everything digital and sleek. I had nothing except what was in my head and whatever was left of my nerve. But I refused to walk out of that room. When the executives took their seats around the table, I stepped forward. My voice shook on the very first sentence, cracking slightly in a way I hoped sounded like enthusiasm and not the sheer terror actually coursing through me. Good morning. My name is Nora Bellamy, and today I'll be walking you through our proposed digital campaign strategy for Meridian's new content platform. My teammate appears to be having some technical difficulties this morning, so I'll be presenting the full deck from memory. Caleb's eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to interrupt, maybe to suggest we reschedule, maybe to say something that would shift the blame onto me, but I kept talking before he could get a word out, my momentum building with every sentence. For the next 18 minutes, I delivered the entire presentation from memory, slide by invisible slide. I described the competitive landscape breakdown I'd built comparing Meridian to 4 direct competitors, walking the executives through pricing tiers and feature gaps I could recite in my sleep after 6 weeks of obsessive revision. I walked through the customer journey map, citing specific data points from the small business owners I'd personally surveyed, the exact percentage who said they'd struggled with content creation, the average hours per week they spent on marketing tasks they didn't understand, the bakery owner who told me she'd once paid a freelancer $400 for a single Instagram caption because she had no idea what else to do. I improvised the financial projections using numbers I had memorized purely out of obsessive preparation, numbers I'd checked and rechecked so many times over 6 weeks that they'd become permanently lodged somewhere behind my sternum. I described charts that no longer existed anywhere except in my own mind, gesturing at the blank projector screen as if the visuals were still there, tracing invisible bar graphs in the air with my hand, letting my voice carry the weight the slides no longer could. Around minute 6, my voice cracked slightly on a transition sentence, and I saw one of the junior executives glance toward Claire Donovan with an expression I couldn't quite read. I thought, in that instant, that I'd lost them. Instead, Claire leaned forward slightly, pen poised over a legal pad, and said simply, "Keep going. This is good." Something about those 4 words steadied me more than anything else could have. I poured every ounce of desperation and fury and pride into that room. Somewhere around minute 10, the fear stopped mattering and something else took over, something that felt less like panic and more like defiance. I stopped thinking about Caleb standing beside me entirely. I stopped thinking about the 6 weeks of work that had vanished in 60 seconds. I thought only about the 40 business owners who had given me their time, about my parents standing behind a pharmacy counter, about the plaque from that first case competition still sitting on a shelf in my childhood bedroom, and I let all of it carry me through sentence after sentence. The executives looked increasingly engaged rather than confused. They leaned forward. They asked tough, pointed questions about customer acquisition costs, about our assumptions on churn rate, about how we differentiate the platform from 3 established competitors already dominating the space. I answered every single one, sometimes citing statistics I hadn't planned to mention until I realized mid-sentence they were the perfect answer to exactly what had been asked. Caleb stood beside me for most of it like a ghost, pale and useless, occasionally attempting to insert a comment that fell completely flat because he had no content to back it up, no backup file, no printed notes, nothing. The one time he tried to jump in with a financial figure, he got it wrong by nearly $500,000, and I had to correct him gently in real time in front of the executives, which visibly rattled him further. When it finally ended, the lead executive, the woman with the silver-streaked hair, whose name I would later learn was Claire Donovan, director of marketing at Meridian, stood and shook my hand firmly, her grip surprisingly strong. "That was one of the most impressive solo deliveries I've seen in 12 years of doing these campus visits," she said, and I could hear that she meant it, that it wasn't just corporate politeness. Truly remarkable resilience under pressure. The 3 of them gathered their things and left the room with Professor Holloway trailing behind them, already asking questions I couldn't quite hear over the ringing in my own ears. I turned to Caleb. He was pale, his jaw tight, his earlier composure completely gone. "You'll never get it now," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "And even if you somehow do, I'll make sure everyone in this program knows exactly who you are and exactly what you did." He didn't respond. For the first time in 2 years, Caleb Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say. The immediate aftermath was brutal, and it happened faster than I could have prepared for. Caleb tried to spin the story almost instantly, cornering Professor Holloway in his office that same afternoon before I even had the chance to explain my side. He claimed I had forgotten to save the files properly, that some kind of accidental sync error had wiped the shared drive, and that he had personally scrambled to try to save the presentation once he realized what had happened. It was a clever lie, built on just enough plausibility to survive a first pass, and for about 18 hours, it worked. But Meridian, as it turned out, had recorded the entire session, standard practice for their campus recruiting visits, something neither Caleb nor I had known going in. The recording captured everything. My opening line about technical difficulties. Caleb's face when I said it. The 18 minutes of me presenting alone while he stood there contributing nothing. It captured, indirectly, every single second of a story that made his version fall apart the moment anyone actually watched it. I found out about Caleb's version of events almost by accident. A classmate, Devin, who worked part-time in the department office, texted me that afternoon asking if I was okay, and mentioned that Caleb had been in with Professor Holloway for nearly 40 minutes right after our slot. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed reading that text, feeling something cold settle in my chest that was almost worse than the betrayal itself, the realization that he wasn't just walking away from what he'd done, he was actively trying to rewrite it before I even had a chance to speak for myself. I went to see Professor Holloway myself the next morning, before my first class, still not entirely sure what I was going to say. He was sitting behind his cluttered desk, surrounded by the usual stacks of ungraded case studies, and he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, not quite sympathy, not quite suspicion, something cautious in between. Caleb came to see me yesterday, he said carefully, before I could even start. He mentioned there was some kind of file issue. There wasn't a file issue, I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking slightly despite my best effort to keep it steady. He deleted everything on purpose, for minutes before we were supposed to present. He told me himself, Professor. He told me Meridian only wanted one intern and he'd decided it should be him. Professor Holloway was quiet for a long moment, tapping his pen against a legal pad. That's a serious accusation, Nora. I know it is. I'm not making it lightly. I took a breath. I don't have proof beyond what he said to my face, but I know Meridian records these sessions. If there's any way to get access to that recording, it would show exactly what happened. It would show I had nothing in front of me and he barely said a word. He nodded slowly, and something in his posture shifted, like a man recalculating a problem he'd thought was already solved. I'll reach out to their recruiting coordinator today, he said. I want to be clear that I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet. But if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't something the department can simply let go. The truth started to surface within 2 days, but not fast enough to save the official outcome. Because of the technical failure, as it was classified on paper, our team was marked down significantly in the university's own internal scoring rubric, a rubric that didn't account for the fact that one team member had sabotaged the other. I still received a partial grade for the course, largely because Professor Holloway personally advocated for me once he reviewed the footage, but it wasn't enough to secure the Meridian internship through the official university channel. Caleb's father had made calls before the presentation had even started, and in the immediate chaos of the aftermath, the school's career office, under pressure from a fairly significant donor relationship Caleb's family held with the business school, quietly recommended Caleb as the sole intern candidate from our cohort. I was devastated in a way I don't think I can fully put into words even now. My parents had worked double shifts at the pharmacy for years to support my education, skipping vacations, driving cars held together mostly by hope and duct tape, so that I could have opportunities they never had. I had to call my mother that night and tell her I had failed at the final hurdle, that the 6 weeks of work and the years before it had ended with someone else's name attached to the outcome. I remember the long pause on the other end of the line before she said, gently, "We're proud of you no matter what," and somehow that gentleness hurt worse than if she'd yelled at me. I could hear the disappointment underneath the kindness, not disappointment in me, but in the unfairness of it, and that was almost harder to sit with. My father got on the phone a few minutes later and, in his usual quiet way, just said, "Tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning." I did. He listened without interrupting once, and at the end of it he said only, "That boy has a problem that has nothing to do with you," which I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. For nearly 2 weeks, I barely left my apartment except for classes I couldn't afford to skip. I turned down every invitation to go out, including a friend's birthday dinner I'd been looking forward to for a month. I stopped checking my email obsessively the way I used to, because every notification felt like it might be another confirmation that I had lost something I could never get back. My roommate, Priya, tried more than once to get me to talk about it properly instead of just replaying the 5 minutes in that conference room over and over in my head, but I wasn't ready yet. I remember eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row because cooking felt like more effort than I had available to give. I questioned everything during those 2 weeks, my abilities, my judgment in choosing Caleb as a partner in the first place, whether I had the kind of resilience this industry actually required, whether trust itself was a liability I needed to unlearn entirely. I replayed our 2 years of partnership on a loop, searching backward for warning signs I must have missed, some earlier moment of coldness or calculation I'd overlooked because I hadn't wanted to see it. I never found one. That was almost the hardest part, realizing that people can seem entirely genuine right up until the moment their interests diverge from yours, and there's no reliable early warning system for that kind of thing. And then, somewhere around day 13, lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, listening to Priya's television murmuring faintly through the wall, I made a decision. I was not going to let Caleb Whitmore win. Not like this. Not after everything my parents had sacrificed and everything I had built with my own 2 hands over 6 exhausting weeks. I got up, made myself a cup of tea I barely drank, and opened my laptop for the first time in days. I still had something Caleb didn't know about, something I hadn't even fully registered as important until I forced myself to sit down and think clearly about what resources I actually had left. During our 6 weeks of preparation, out of nothing more than my own compulsive, borderline paranoid habit of over-preparing, I had kept a complete offline backup of every version of the presentation on a small external hard drive I stored in my apartment. I also had detailed script notes, earlier drafts, and design files saved in a personal cloud account under my university email, an account Caleb had never had access to because I'd set it up independently back in week 2, purely as a personal habit rather than any kind of foresight about betrayal. I hadn't even told him it existed. It felt, in hindsight, almost providential. I spent the next 48 hours rebuilding the entire presentation from that backup, barely sleeping, fueled mostly by leftover tea and a kind of clear-headed anger I hadn't experienced before. Honestly, the version I built in those 2 sleepless days was better than the original. I refined the language throughout, cutting anything that sounded even slightly like filler. I tightened the data visualizations, redesigning 2 charts that had always bothered me but that I'd never had time to fix under the original deadline. I cut 2 slides that had always felt slightly weak and replaced them with a sharper competitive analysis I'd been wanting to add for weeks but hadn't had time to finish. Grief and Fury turned out to be excellent editors, more ruthless with my own work than I'd ever been able to be under normal circumstances. Somewhere around hour 30, Priya knocked on my door with a plate of toast I hadn't asked for and sat with me quietly while I worked, not saying much, just present in the way good friends know how to be when words won't actually help. She read a few slides over my shoulder and told me, flatly, "This is genuinely good, Nora. Like, this is better than good." I didn't fully believe her at the time, but I kept working anyway. Once it was done, I made a decision that felt terrifying at the time. I reached out directly to the Meridian executives who had watched me present, using the contact information from the business cards they'd left with Professor Holloway's office. I rewrote the email 4 separate times, trying to strike a balance between honesty and professionalism, careful not to sound bitter even though I felt it in every cell of my body. I wrote a long, careful email explaining exactly what had happened, attaching both the recording Meridian's own team had captured and the fully rebuilt deck, polished and complete, exactly as it should have looked that morning. I hit send at 11:40 at night and then sat staring at my inbox for almost an hour afterward, half expecting nothing to ever come of it. Claire Donovan responded personally within 6 hours. She was, in her own words, deeply troubled by what she'd learned. Meridian, she explained, prided itself on integrity as a core value baked into how they evaluated every candidate, not just their technical skills. She admitted, with more candor than I expected from a corporate executive, that there had already been some internal discomfort about the pressure applied by a family connection ahead of the presentation, pressure that had, in her words, created an uncomfortable dynamic before we even walked into that room. 2 days later, she invited me to a private interview at Meridian's regional office, completely separate from the university recruiting pipeline. I remember standing outside the building the morning of the interview, staring up at the glass facade, feeling a strange mixture of terror and something close to gratitude that I was even being given this second chance at all. I prepared for that interview the way I'd prepared for the original presentation, except this time I made 3 separate backups of everything I brought with me, stored in 3 different places, one on a flash drive in my bag, one in a cloud folder, one printed on actual paper, a habit I have never once abandoned since. The interview itself lasted almost 90 minutes, far longer than I'd expected, and covered everything from my survey methodology with the small business owners to how I'd handled the pressure of losing my materials minutes before presenting. Claire asked me directly, at one point, whether I harbored resentment toward Caleb. I told her honestly that I did, and that I was working on it, and that I thought pretending otherwise would be a worse answer than the truth. She seemed to appreciate that more than any rehearsed answer could have landed. I nailed it. 1 week after that interview, I received an offer, not just for the standard internship, but for an expanded 12-month program that came with direct mentorship from Claire herself, something Meridian apparently reserved for candidates they considered exceptional rather than merely qualified. I read the offer letter 3 times before I actually believed it was real, then called my mother at the pharmacy in the middle of her shift, something I almost never did, because I couldn't wait the 6 hours until she got home. Caleb's offer, I later learned through the campus grapevine, was quietly withdrawn about 10 days after mine was extended. According to Devin, who heard it secondhand from someone in the career office, Meridian had conducted a deeper background review once the full story came out, pulling together statements from Professor Holloway, the recording from the presentation itself, and apparently a somewhat tense phone call between Claire Donovan and Caleb's father, who had tried, once again, to smooth things over the way he'd smoothed over so many things before. This time it didn't work. His father's influence, it turned out, could only stretch so far once the company recognized the ethical liability sitting inside their own recruiting pipeline. A firm like Meridian, built partly on a brand promise of trustworthy, ethical technology for small businesses, could not afford to have its very first cohort of interns include someone who had sabotaged a colleague on tape. I heard, though I was never able to fully confirm it, that Claire told Caleb's father directly during that final call that Meridian didn't do business with people who treated colleagues as disposable obstacles, and that if his son wanted a future in this industry, he was going to have to build it on merit rather than on a phone call. Nobody at Meridian wanted their name attached to a scandal before an intern had even started, and once the recording made its way to the right people internally, the decision, from what I understand, wasn't even much of a debate. The real reckoning came gradually, in the way these things usually do, spreading through the small, gossip-hungry ecosystem of a business school where everyone knew everyone's business within about 72 hours of anything happening. It started, as these things often do, with a single leaked detail. Devon told two people in confidence about what she'd overheard outside Professor Holloway's office, swearing them both to secrecy, and within a week the broad outline of the story had somehow reached almost every senior in our program, mutating slightly with each retelling the way rumors always do. By the time it reached the edges of the rumor mill, some versions had Caleb erasing our files from a company laptop, others had him bragging about it to his fraternity brothers the night before, which, as far as I ever learned, wasn't quite accurate but also wasn't entirely far from the spirit of what actually happened. A few classmates reached out to me directly once the story started circulating, some out of genuine concern, a couple, I suspected, mostly out of curiosity. One girl from my statistics class, someone I'd barely spoken 20 words to across 3 years, stopped me in the hallway outside the library to say, quietly, "I heard what he did. I just wanted you to know a lot of us think what you did in that room was incredible." I didn't know what to say to that at the time beyond a quiet thank you, but it stayed with me longer than I expected it to. It was the first moment I understood that the story wasn't just something that had happened to me privately, it had become, in its own small way, something other people were watching and drawing their own conclusions from about what mattered and what didn't. Caleb's reputation on campus never recovered. Word of what he'd done spread fast among our cohort, especially once a few classmates who'd heard rumblings from Professor Holloway's office started asking pointed questions, and once someone, I never found out exactly who, though I had my suspicions it traced back to Devon despite her promises of secrecy, got hold of a partial transcript from the recording. By the following semester, almost nobody in our program wanted to be paired with him for group projects, and I noticed, without ever directly orchestrating it, that even casual acquaintances of his had started keeping a polite but noticeable distance in shared classes. Professors, subtly but unmistakably, began watching him more closely during team assignments, occasionally rotating group compositions in ways that seemed designed specifically to keep him from repeating whatever pattern had led to this outcome. One professor, I later heard, began requiring individual accountability statements at the end of every group project specifically because of what had happened to us, a small procedural change that outlasted both of us at the school and, in its own quiet way, became the most lasting mark either of us left on that program. He graduated on schedule, technically, but with far fewer doors open to him than he'd expected walking into senior year. A few of his fraternity brothers distanced themselves once the story became common knowledge, apparently uncomfortable with how casually he'd described the whole thing when he thought only sympathetic ears were listening. I heard secondhand that he'd referred to it once as just doing what anyone would do in that position, a line that did not land well with people who considered themselves his friends. Last I heard through a mutual acquaintance, he'd taken a fairly unremarkable sales position at a regional software company, nothing close to the trajectory his family connections had once seemed to guarantee him, and was reportedly still living partially off his father's financial support while trying, somewhat awkwardly, to rebuild a polished professional image on LinkedIn, posting the kind of generic motivational content that always seems to attract more eye rolls than admiration from people who actually know the person behind it. I ran into him exactly once after graduation, almost 2 years later, at a regional marketing conference neither of us expected the other to attend. He looked older in a way that had nothing to do with age, more tired around the eyes, less certain of himself than the version of him I remembered from our sophomore year seminar. He approached me near the coffee station, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "You look good," he finally said. "Meridian's been good to you, obviously." "It has," I said, and left it there, because I genuinely had nothing else I wanted to give him. He shifted his weight, glanced down at his badge, then back up at me. "For what it's worth, I think about that morning more than you'd probably guess." I didn't respond to that either. Some apologies arrive too late to mean anything, and I've come to believe that's not cruelty on the part of the person who declines to accept them, it's simply the natural expiration date on trust once it's been deliberately broken. I nodded once, politely, and walked back toward my own table before the conversation could go any further. I, on the other hand, thrived. The internship at Meridian turned into a full-time offer after graduation, exactly as the program's reputation had promised. Within 2 years, I was promoted to marketing strategist, and within 4, I was leading campaigns that reached audiences in the millions across 3 different product lines. I led the launch strategy for the very content platform I had once pitched from memory in an empty conference room, watching it grow from a slide deck built out of desperation into a product that real small business owners across the country now actually used every day. Sometimes, late at night working on a new campaign, I would think about that bakery owner who had told me about the $400 Instagram caption, and I would feel a small, private satisfaction knowing that somewhere, business owners like her had one less thing to worry about because of work I had helped build. Claire became not just a supervisor but a genuine mentor and, eventually, a friend, someone I still call when I need advice that isn't filtered through corporate politeness, someone who took a chance on an email from a devastated 22-year-old and never once let me forget that she'd believed in the work before she'd fully believed in the story behind it. I made a point of paying it forward once I had the standing to do so. I started a mentorship initiative for first-generation college students in our program, specifically focused on things nobody had ever taught me directly: how to protect your own work, how to build redundancy into everything you create, how trust and verification are not opposites but partners rather than competing values. I called it, half-jokingly at first and then permanently once the name stuck among the students themselves, the backup rule. Keep 3 copies of everything that matters, I tell every student in that program during their first session, watching some of them nod politely without fully understanding yet why it matters so much. Not because you expect betrayal, but because you can't always predict who might disappoint you, and your future shouldn't depend entirely on someone else's character, however trustworthy that character might currently appear. Over the years, the mentorship program grew from 4 students in its first cohort to nearly 40 by its 5th year, and I've made a habit of telling an abbreviated, less raw version of my own story to each new group, not for sympathy, but because I think it's the kind of thing that's more useful to hear before it happens to you than after. One student in particular, a sophomore named Grace who reminded me uncomfortably of my younger self, came to me during office hours in the program's 3rd year, visibly shaken, explaining that her own project partner had just tried something eerily similar during a smaller class presentation, not deleting files outright, but quietly taking credit for her research in front of a recruiter from a firm Grace had been eyeing since freshman year. She hadn't lost everything the way I had, but the betrayal had rattled her badly enough that she was seriously considering dropping the class rather than confronting it. We sat together for almost 2 hours that afternoon while I walked her through exactly what I wished someone had told me: how to document everything, how to communicate directly and calmly with the people evaluating her work, how to separate the sting of betrayal from the practical steps required to protect her own future regardless of what anyone else had done. Grace ended up not only staying in the class but presenting an addendum directly to the visiting recruiter that laid out her individual contributions with a clarity and confidence I recognized immediately, because it was the same defiance that had carried me through 18 minutes in an empty conference room years earlier. She got the internship. Her former partner did not. She sends me a card every winter, and I keep every single one of them in the top drawer of my desk, underneath the framed still frame Claire once gave me. Moments like that one are the closest thing I have to real closure regarding what happened with Caleb. I can't undo those 5 minutes in that conference room, and I've stopped wanting to in any literal sense. But watching someone like Grace walk through a smaller version of the same nightmare and come out the other side intact, partly because of something I was able to pass along, has done more to settle the whole experience in my chest than any apology from Caleb ever could have. Graduation itself, when it finally arrived that spring, felt strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. I sat in a folding chair on the quad in a black gown that was slightly too big for me, half listening to a keynote speaker talk about resilience and reinvention, thinking about how much had changed in the span of a single semester. My parents drove up for the ceremony, my mother taking a rare day off from the pharmacy, my father wearing the one suit he owned, the same one from my cousin's wedding 2 years earlier. When my name was called and I crossed the stage, I looked out into the crowd and found them immediately, my mother already crying, my father clapping harder than the moment probably called for, and I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since that morning in the conference room months earlier. Afterward, at a small reception on the lawn, my mother pulled me aside and pressed something into my hand, a small silver keychain shaped like a tiny house, worn smooth at the edges. "Your grandmother gave me this the day I opened the pharmacy," she said. "She told me to keep it somewhere I'd see it every day, as a reminder that nothing good gets built without someone believing in you before you've proven anything." I still keep that keychain clipped to my work bag today, a small, unglamorous object that means more to me than almost anything else I own. Caleb graduated in the same ceremony, seated several rows away, and I remember seeing him from a distance during the processional, dressed exactly as sharply as always, flanked by family who looked proud in the uninformed way families often do at these events. We didn't speak that day. I'm not sure either of us wanted to, and I felt no particular urge to seek him out or make a scene of any kind. The satisfaction I might have once imagined feeling in that moment, some dramatic confrontation, some public reckoning, never actually arrived, and I've come to understand that's usually how real justice works. Quiet. Administrative. Handled in background checks and withdrawn offers rather than confrontations on a sunny lawn in front of 200 families. Last year, out of nowhere, Caleb sent me a connection request on LinkedIn with a generic, oddly formal message, "Congrats on your success. Would love to reconnect sometime." I let it sit pending for about a week, genuinely unsure at first how I felt about it, and then declined it quietly without any explanation. Some messages don't deserve a response. Some bridges deserve to stay exactly as burned as they became. Today, I sit in my own office on the 14th floor of Meridian's headquarters, with a window that looks out over a skyline I once only saw in photos on the company's recruiting website. A framed copy of my original offer letter hangs on the wall near my desk, not out of vanity, but as a reminder of exactly what it cost to get here and exactly what I'm capable of when everything I thought I could rely on disappears in an instant. Beside it hangs a small printed still frame from the recording Meridian captured that morning, a slightly blurry image of me mid-sentence in front of a blank projector screen, arms raised as though a chart were still glowing behind me. Claire gave it to me as a gift on my second work anniversary, with a handwritten note that simply said, "Never forget you did this with nothing but your own memory and nerve." I've kept it exactly where she placed it ever since. Betrayal has a strange way of revealing who people truly are underneath the version of themselves they show you every day. Caleb showed me his true colors 5 minutes before the most important presentation of my life, and I have never once regretted knowing the truth, even though the timing of it nearly destroyed me. There are still moments, rare now but not entirely gone, when I catch myself bracing slightly before handing off an important piece of work to a new colleague, a small residual flinch left over from that morning that I doubt will ever fully disappear. I've made peace with that. Not every scar needs to heal completely to stop being painful. Some of them just become part of how carefully you move through the world afterward. But in the end, deleting those slides didn't delete my future. It only clarified it, sharpened it into something more deliberate and less naive than what I'd been building before. I no longer walk into important moments assuming someone else will carry half the weight without question. I build my own contingency plans now, in every area of my life, not out of paranoia, but out of hard-earned wisdom passed down to me by nobody except my own worst morning. I keep my own backups, my own records, my own quiet insurance against the possibility that someone I trust might, one day, decide their interests and mine no longer align. It isn't cynicism. I still trust people, still build real partnerships, still believe most of the people I work with mean exactly what they say. But I no longer confuse trust with an excuse to leave myself unprotected. And no one, no matter how close, no matter how charming, no matter how many powerful people stand behind them, will ever again take something from me that I haven't already protected 3 times over. That morning in that conference room cost me almost everything I thought I had. It also, in the strangest way possible, gave me the exact foundation everything afterward was built on. Sometimes, when a new hire joins my team at Meridian, nervous and eager the way I once was, I think about telling them the whole story from start to finish, the version without any of the polish I give it during mentorship sessions. I usually don't. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I've learned that the lesson lands better when people discover the shape of it themselves, in their own time, through their own smaller trials rather than through a cautionary tale delivered secondhand. Instead, I just make sure, quietly and without announcement, that every project I lead has redundancy built into it from day one, shared drives with proper permissions, version histories nobody can quietly erase, documentation habits that protect everyone on the team equally, not just me. It's become such an ingrained part of how I manage people that most of my colleagues probably assume it's simply good practice rather than the scar tissue of a single terrible morning years ago. I think about my parents often when I consider how far I've come from that pharmacy counter, and I try to visit them more than my schedule technically allows, because I never want to become someone who forgets exactly what was sacrificed to get me here. My mother still keeps a framed photo from my graduation on the shelf behind the pharmacy register, next to the plaque from that very first case competition Caleb and I won together sophomore year, which I never had the heart to throw away despite everything that came after. It sits there as a strange, complicated artifact of who we used to be to each other, before ambition curdled into something neither of us could have predicted at 20 years old. Laughing together on a stage in a rented hotel ballroom, genuinely believing we were building something that would last. We weren't. But something else was built in its place, something sturdier, forged in the 5 worst minutes of my life and the 18 that followed them. I wouldn't wish that morning on anyone. But I no longer wish it away either. And that's how my own teammate tried to destroy my future 5 minutes before the biggest presentation of my life, and how I rose stronger, smarter, and more successful than he could ever dream. Never let anyone steal your moment. Protect your work, trust your instincts, and always have a backup plan. Drop your own betrayal stories in the comments, I read every single one. Like if you believe in karma, and subscribe for more real-life comeback stories every week. Thank you for watching. Your future is yours to protect. See you next time.